Salvete discipuli, and welcome to Latin class. Today we will be learning about verb inflections, the first step in learning to read Latin. You will need one verb chart, which you can get in the folder marked Chapter 2 Resources, or you can get it from me. If you got your verb charts from me, you will want to use the blue chart for this section of the lesson. If you are using a digital copy of the verb chart, please make sure it says at the top, active voice verb inflections. At this point in time, pause the video and copy down onto your chart the notes that appear here. Anything that is not already written on your chart is something that you should include as notes. Now that you are finished writing the notes on your chart, let's talk about what they all mean. First of all, remember that an inflection appears on the end of a word. Verb inflections will appear on the end of verbs, and an inflection is going to tell us specific information about the word that it is attached to. A verb inflection tells us what tense the verb is in, and it also tells us what the person or subject of the verb is. Person is also associated with number, meaning singular or plural. The endings that you have written on your chart represent the present tense. Because the verbs that use these endings are written in the present tense, when you translate them into English, you must use one of the sample translations that are written on your chart. Instead of using an actual verb, I just used the word verb so that you could replace that with any action. For example, I could say love or loves, am, is, or are loving, or do or does love. Specific ways to translate the verbs with these different inflections will follow this explanation of the note chart. Now let's discuss how to incorporate the subject of the verb inflection. Every inflection not only represents the fact that the verb you see it on is in the present tense, but that verb also has a very specific subject. If you see the letters O or M on the end of the verb, the subject of the verb is I. And when you translate it, you must translate it with I as the subject. So I love or I am giving. When you see the letter S on the end of a verb, it means that the subject is you singular. So I would have to translate the verb as you do listen, or you are walking. When I see the letter T on the end of a verb, it means that the subject is he, she, or it. It can also mean that the subject is a singular noun. When I translate the verb into English, I must translate it using one of the pronouns he, she, or it, like he talks, or he is writing, or I must use the noun in the sentence that is the subject. When the verb ends with mus, its subject is we. When I translate the verb, I must translate the verb as we are giving, or we walk. If I see the letters TIS on the end of the verb, I know that the subject of my verb is you in the plural, and therefore when I translate my verb, I must translate it into English by saying you love, you are giving, or you do walk. Finally, when I see the letters NT on a verb, I know that the subject of the verb is they. I can also use a plural noun or two singular nouns as the subject of a verb that ends with the inflection nt. When I translate it into English, I must translate it using the phrasing, they love, they are walking, they do give. Remember that if there is a plural noun or two singular nouns as the subject, I must translate the nouns as the subject and not the pronoun. Now let's take a look at some verbs which are using these inflectional endings and see examples of how we should translate them. The first verb that we are going to look at is do dara, which means to give. It's written as do. Notice the O on the end of the verb form do. That means that the subject is I and that it is written in the present tense. So I can translate that verb as I give, I am giving, or I do give. The next verb is moneo monera, which means to warn. Notice that in the conjugated verb form mones, the verb ends with the letter S. S represents the subject you and tells me that the verb is in the present tense. Therefore, when I translate the verb into English, I must say you warn, or you are warning, or even you do warn. For this next example, we will look once again at the verb to give, do dara. Notice that now it ends with the letter T. T represents the subject he, she, or it. And it also tells me that the verb is in the present tense. Because there is no noun written with this word, I must use the pronoun he, she, or it as its subject. Any one of them would be correct because there is no context for translating the verb. And so that is why I have written as a correct translation for this verb, he gives, he is giving, or he does give. We now return to the verb to warn, moneo monera. This time when we see the verb written, monemus, we should notice that it ends with the letters mus. Mus, the inflection, represents the subject we, and also represents that the verb is in the present tense. When we translate monemus into English, we must say we warn, or we are warning, or we do warn. Which one we use will not matter. It will all depend on what sounds correct for the context of the sentence. Now you should notice that our verb moneo monera, to warn, ends with the inflection tis, or tis. Tis, or tis, represents the subject you in the plural and also means that the verb is in the present tense. So when I translate monetis into English, I must translate it in one of these three ways. You warn, you are warning, or you do warn. One final example returns us to the verb to give, do dara. Notice that this time the verb ends with the inflection nt. Whenever we see nt on a verb, we must know that the verb is written in the present tense and that the subject is they. The subject could also be a plural noun or two singular nouns. Because this verb does not have any nouns written with it, we must use the pronoun they as its subject and translate it in the present tense in one of these three ways. They give, they are giving, and they do give. Remember, these inflections are used only on verbs. Remember that each inflection represents a specific subject. Remember that these endings represent the present tense and only the present tense. Your job is to memorize these endings and the information that they represent, so that when you see them in a Latin text, you will be able to read them and know what the author is saying. This concludes our lesson on Latin verb inflections. That means that you're now ready to begin the work of memorizing and becoming very, very familiar with how Latin verb inflections are used. See Mrs. Johnson for further instructions. You can also find additional instructions in our Schoology classroom. Class dismissed.